And quite a memo it is. It is just a memo note, but it goes right across all government departments, right across the whole of the economy, and right across the UK. And at the heart of it, the potential to have a carbon tax on wide swathes of what we do, what we manufacture, produce, and indeed, as you said, what we eat. Now that matters in two forms, because if you cost something, as Boris Johnson and the Treasury, that's important, want, then you can tax it. Matters because long-term the Treasury is getting less revenue from massive traditional sources like fossil fuels, and in the short term it matters because of this city, Glasgow, crucial climate conference coming up here in November. The UK is the joint leaders of that and needs to show leadership. It's far from being law, but it's far from being a vague idea either. The practical bit: you tax all companies for the carbon they emit in manufacturing, agriculture, transport, supply chains, energy, pretty much anything. The optimistic bit: you then hope, cajole and encourage other nations worldwide to do the same, and then that impacts on global carbon pollution. So let's take one representative industry: whiskey. It's big, it's rich, it's global, but it's traditionally a heavy carbon polluter. Aberfeldy in the Highlands, just the kind of place where an economy-wide polluter pays carbon tax will hit home. They've distilled whiskey here for more than 120 years. A global industry, of course, worth hundreds of millions, but carbon intensive.
We're converting malty barley, which is a very hard-packed grain, so we have to grind that down to expose the starch.
And that all needs power, that all needs heat.
It all needs heat, it all needs energy, and so it is energy intensive.
Which is why the chimneys dominate distilleries, monuments to generations of heavy fossil fuel carbon emission. But the wider struggle for the Scottish whisky industry is still to find that holy grail, a way of making the main fuel source at distilleries entirely green. The main furnace here converted from coal to heavy fuel oil and now to biomass. What difference does that make to your carbon output?
Well, between this distillery and our sibling distillery, we reduced our carbon footprint by 90%.
But the backup system here is still heavy fuel oil, showing how far this industry has got to go still to clean up its act. But if your dram will cost more, so too will your lamb, your beef, your cheese, you name it, all carbon-heavy polluters. So why, and why now? Well, the Treasury needs tax, and massive tax takes like transport are going as petroleum and diesel fade into history.
Fuel duty alone accounts for something around £28 billion per year of government tax receipts. So that's 28 billion reasons to worry about the Prime Minister's commitment to phase out petrol and diesel cars by 2030. So I don't think it's a great surprise that the Chancellor is thinking of a change. In fact, I think it's a really good thing that he's thinking strategically about that now.
Boris Johnson also needs a grand gesture designed to pull other countries into line in the run-up to the vital climate conference here in Glasgow in November. Fantastic if major competing economies do sign up, but the potential for domestic disadvantage is clear.
We've got to be ambitious on climate change. I want the UK to be the world's most sustainable producer of food and drink, but we can't charge ahead of the rest of the world here, or else we risk being less competitive. And then what we'll have is a perverse impact where we export our food production capability elsewhere, and we end up feeding ourselves more on imports, probably coming from systems less sustainable than we have here.
Inchdairney in Fife, one of Scotland's most modern whisky distilleries with carbon reduction built into the design. Now, though, their push for carbon neutrality will be galvanised by looming carbon taxes. But they're not waiting, already trying to get out of gas and into hydrogen.
We could bring in the hydrogen that's been produced locally, store it here and burn it in the boiler. Or we could produce it here using electrolysis. We're investigating putting solar panels onto the roof of the warehousing to give us some of that energy.
Well, whisky's just one global economic sector in the UK, of course, but its green evolution mirrors wider industry.
Today's proposed carbon tax underlines the imperative for that evolution to become revolution. If the climate crisis doesn't get you, the inland revenue will.
Well, I'm joined now by the former Conservative Environment Secretary, Lord Deben, who is now chairman of the UK's Independent Committee on Climate Change. Lord Deben, is the government on the right lines, trying to charge for carbon emissions?
Yes, I think it is. I'm myself a believer in using taxation, but also using encouragement in other ways, and also using regulation. And it seems to me that there's a lot to be said for improving our system of carbon trading, which is another way of doing it and is a way in which the United States will join in as well.
Right, but if this means the price of meat and cheese and your gas bill goes up substantially, I mean, isn't that quite old-fashioned? Weren't we being told that the transition to a greener economy wasn't going to cost us, that it was going to be all about carrot rather than stick?
Well, you haven't mentioned the fact that 80% of the country has both gas and electricity. At the moment, the whole weight of the cost of the transition goes on the electricity. Now, there's no reason why you can't shift that tax that is on electricity towards gas, which would in fact encourage people to move in the cleaner direction. And of course, their bills would remain much the same because you had moved the burden. And that would help the poorest, because many of the poorest don't have gas. They depend on electricity. And this is therefore a retrograde system, a regressive tax. So there's a lot that you can do in order to help the poorest and make sure that those who can pay do pay, but that the state as a whole makes that transition fair. And that, for me, is absolutely crucial.
Does the government feel to you as though it has a strategy on meeting its aims?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, the real trouble is that it has a strategy, a broad strategy. It now has the detail of how you produce that strategy and make it work from the Climate Change Committee in our 6th carbon budget. But it really does have to get down to the detail to tell us exactly what it is going to do, so that business can use all the innovation and cleverness in order to meet what we need to do to reduce our emissions, but to do so in an innovative and cheaper way. It ought to be a way of making things cheaper. After all, by 2030, it will be significantly cheaper to have an electric car than to have a petrol-driven car. And in the meantime, we've got to make that transition work, and work, as I say, in a just manner.
Right, but I mean, as we've spoken before on this programme, I mean, if you want to really change behaviour and get people to stop heating their homes with gas and move over to things like heat pumps, which are very, very expensive at the moment by comparison to gas, you're going to have to tax gas massively. I mean, it would be over 1,000% before you're making, heat pumps competitive with gas at those prices.
No, well, that's if that's the only thing you do. But if at the same time you enable people to do it by giving them help, particularly giving the fuel poor help, by getting local and regional and national authorities working on plans to make that possible, if at the same time you provide incentives for improvements, and at the same time you shift the taxation system so that it encourages innovation, all that can come together. You're arguing as if the only thing you do is the tax. Now, I don't think
I'm pointing out the Chancellor's skint. He's got no money, and all of those things cost money, and he's looking to pay off debt.
Well, quite a lot of those things don't cost money any more than we're using at the moment. If we use that money more effectively and efficiently, and if we use local government and regional government more effectively and efficiently, we can deliver that. And particularly if we encourage the investment from the private sector, our view is that this change is going to be largely paid for by the private sector. The government has got to create the circumstances in which that investment takes place. If we do that, and if we make sure that the weight of the cost doesn't land on those who are least able to afford it, then there's no reason at all why tax can't play a part. But it is not the enormous part of which you speak.
Where does a new coal mine fit into the government's low carbon strategy?
Well, their argument is that if you produce the coal that you need for steel in this country instead of importing it, that is lower carbon. Of course, after 2035 or 6, that coal can only be used if you use carbon capture and storage, and it therefore becomes a very, very low carbon indeed. What I have said to the government that it really must explain to the people who are doing the investment that after 2036 they will not be able to sell their coal to be used unless they are helping and encouraging and paying part of the price for carbon capture and storage to make sure that it doesn't create the damage which it will do otherwise.
Lord